Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Today we have a double portion, which brings to mind the late Lubavitcher Rabbi, who at the young age of 90 years of age used to stand for hours on end in order to give people money so that they will give it to tzedakah and empower themselves with the power, redeeming quality of tzedakah. Every now and then he would be inspired to give certain individuals $2 instead of a $1 bill, and he would say with this thick Eastern European accent, double portion. So this week we have a double portion, Baruch Hashem. We have the Torah portions of Matot, which means the heads of the tribes, and it also is like a pole or a staff of a flag, and the Parashot of Masei, which means journeys in the plural. And these two parashot are usually read in concert, not at the Hollywood Bowl, but in concert. And they conclude for us the fourth of the 5 books of the Torah, the book of Numbers, Bamidbar. This Shabbat is also the second Shabbat of the 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av. So once more we have a glum, a prophecy of rebuke and devastation by Jeremiah. Last week's Haftarah for the first of the 3 weeks of calamities leading up to Tisha B'Av was the opening section of Jeremiah, and this week's Haftarah continues from Jeremiah chapter 2, verse 4. But first thing is first. Parashat Matot, the opening of the first of the 2 Torah portions this Shabbat, which can be found in our book on page 823, verse 2, which is the book of Numbers Bamidbar, chapter 30, verse 2. And our parasha starts with a new theme. This is a very voluminous theme. It's a theme and a Jewish principle and framework which actually has its own tractate, its own volume in the Mishnah, in the expansive oral law and rabbinic commentary, based on the beginning of our parasha, of Parashat Matot. What is the beginning of the parasha talking about? It's talking about nedarim, vows, right? Not the kind of colloquial, informal, romantic vows that some people today articulate, let's say on the chuppah, I promise to always love you and be wonderful, but legally, halachically binding vows that people would make, right? People would make a vow to either do something or refrain from doing something. By the way, I learned from some of my rabbis in recent years, if a person makes a vow, let's say, if this and this happens, then I will keep Shabbat or keep kosher, then that's not necessarily a valid vow. Why? Because we're commanded to do it anyway. You're pledging before Hashem, so you better be true to your word, but it's not a vow one would have to undo. So the rabbis take very seriously this whole idea of vows, and they talk about under what scenarios is a vow binding, under what scenario is it not. There's an intricate rabbinic way to undo a vow if you made a vow. And before Rosh Hashanah, on the morning before Rosh Hashanah, we also have a custom, if you come to morning services before Rosh Hashanah, called Hatarat Nedarim, the undoing of vows, where you can sit with two other people, you recite a text before them that's in our prayer book saying, whatever vows have made, knowingly or unknowingly, are hereby rendered null and void. And then the other two respond, there was no real vow here, and it's not binding, and so forth, to undo the vows before the beginning of the new year. And what is for many of us, the most intense spiritual service of the entire Jewish annual calendar? What do you find the most intense prayer? Yom Kippur Kol Nidrei. Neila, yes, you're right. Why not, Mrs.? Of course. Both Neila and Kol Nidrei. Now, Kol Nidrei basically means all my vows. And we're basically saying all the vows that we articulated, and we say the language is ambiguous. The language of the prayer, the liturgy says, Mi Yom Kippurim zeh le Yom Kippurim haba. From this Yom Kippur to next Yom Kippur. So there's a whole rabbinic discussion. What does it mean? Does it mean from this Yom Kippur, which we just started on this night, until the Yom Kippur of next year? Or do they mean from the Yom Kippur of last year until now? Which vows are we talking about? The answer is, in some ways, maybe both. And I think that our tradition is sensitized to the fact that sometimes when we're overcome with emotion, we can make promises and pledges that we might, in good faith, that we might not always be able to keep. Look how seriously our tradition takes words that are articulated. Of course, the Torah teaches that the world was created by divine speech, right? And God said, the Lord said, let there be light, and there was light, right? And so forth. So the idea is that words have great primordial power, spiritual power. And God's word gives life and creates. According to some great philosophers, including some non-Jewish philosophers like Thomas Hobbes and Aristotle, and according to Lahavdil, our philosopher, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, the Sephardic poet and philosopher, theologian, that which renders a human being distinct from all other living species is our capacity for speech. The fact that we can talk, right? So, for example, Rabbi Yehuda Levi, Rabbi Judah Halevi, author of beautiful poems, including a famous poem in which he says, I live in Spain, but my heart is in Jerusalem. Ani libi b'mizrach, my heart is in the furthermost east, va'anochi b'ktzeh ma'arav, I'm at the utmost westward corner. Back then they didn't have Los Angeles, which today we are at the utmost western, right? So Rabbi Judah Levi also wrote the Kozari, which is a philosophical, theological work about Judaism vis-a-vis other religious doctrines, the other monotheistic faiths. So Rabbi Judah Halevi, Rabbi Yehuda Levi says he has a typology. We have inanimate objects in the world, stones, rocks, what have you. Then you have the vegetative, if you like, right? You have plants and trees and what have you. And then you have other life forms, living beings, animals. And Rabbi Judah Levi says, and then you have medaber, right? We are the speaking, the articulating animal. So we take words very seriously, and our sages teach us, Chaim v'mavet beyad halashon. Life and death are at the mercy of one's tongue, right? How did the Holocaust start? I once gave a class to our high schoolers about, one mother asked me to do a class about bullying, which is a terrible epidemic. Today it's also on the social media. And unfortunately every year there are teenagers who take their own lives, or try to, because of the amount of bullying that they're subjected to. And sometimes the bullying is hardly physical. Sometimes it's only verbal, quote unquote, only verbal bullying can kill a person, can bring a person beyond the brink, God forbid. So, I demonstrated to the class, how did the Holocaust start? Hitler himself, Ymar Shmo, mesmerized the German populace with the power of his rhetoric. We watch him, we see a deranged person with erratic body language, and he sounds more like a dog barking than a person speaking. But the Germans somehow were enchanted and bewitched by his diabolical rhetoric. And he had an intellectual by his side called Joseph Goebbels, who was a PhD, a linguist, and mastered some maybe half a dozen languages. He was intellectually brilliant, and he created the propaganda to dehumanize Jews in the eyes of their fellow Germans. Right? And Hitler, Ymar Shmo, used to say, if you repeat a lie enough times, people will believe it. So first Jews were depicted as rats, as mice, as roaches in the documentaries, in the cinemas. So we were verbally dehumanized first, right? So life and death are at the mercy of one's tongue. I can't help but remember and mention that 23 years ago, Prime Minister Rabin was murdered. And there were radical people, I'm not saying everybody, but people in the radical right, very radical right, used to chant, Mavet LeRabin, death to Rabin, and things like that. And after Rabin was murdered, Rabbi Amital, Yehuda Amital Zatzal, Zecher Tzadik Livracha, was a great rabbi and a survivor. He said something very powerful. He said, "We will not be able to say our hands did not shed this blood," which is a quote from the Torah. So we need to remember that the power of speech is a divine gift that we have. It renders us distinct from all other species, and with it we can create hope and love and life and beauty and truth and sanctity. But with words, God forbid, the worst things can happen as well. I did some of my doctoral work in philosophy about intellectuals in politics. And some of the greatest secular thinkers of the 20th century supported totalitarian, murderous regimes. Jean-Paul Sartre at some point supported Stalinism. Martin Heidegger and Carl Schmitt, who were two brilliant German intellectuals, supported Nazism at the beginning of the regime. Michel Foucault, another great French thinker, at the beginning hailed the Shiite revolution in Iran. So we have to remember, a brilliant intellect and great oratory and verbal virtuosity are not always synonymous with morality and ethics. So the bottom line is that we take words very seriously. Words are our working tools to connect to Hashem. Our sages teach us when we study Torah, God speaks to us. And when we pray to Hashem, also with words, we speak to God. Okay? So we have here all these stipulations. And it says when a man makes a vow, he has to live up to it. And then because the Torah came to this world in the ancient Near East, a very patriarchal society. In verse 4, it says, if a woman makes a vow and puts a limitation on herself, let's say she says, I'm not going to eat sushi until September, okay? So it depends. If she is a minor living in her father's household and her father hears it and he says, I know my daughter, she's addicted to sushi, she's not going to be able to do it, he can undo her vow. But if the father hears that she makes this vow, I'm giving a silly example, to refrain from sushi until September, but he if he doesn't do it, then she's bound by it. Okay? And later on, in the ancient Near East, we're talking about a historical era, of course, prior to the emancipation of women, before universal suffrage, before women could vote. There wasn't even representative democracy going around. So women were protected in the sense of, if you look at the ketubah is actually taking care of the rights of women, that they will be financially safe. And God forbid, if the marriage does not succeed, that they will be safe. By the way, I can't help but remark that if you look at the legal formulation of the ketubah, it says that the husband has 3 chief commitments to his wife. One is in terms of clothing. She should be able to have also nice clothing as much as he can afford. Back then when, women didn't work, thank God we're beyond that point now. And in terms of nourishment and food, and the third component of the ketubah talks about a woman's satisfaction in terms of intimacy. Now, this is, I think, an incredible thing. If you think about it, that thousands of years ago, our sages were committed to that kind of reciprocity in marital life. Today we still have a problem in the world, in certain culture, of the abomination of female circumcision for women, which is a crime in every civilized country. But, we should feel good about ourselves, I think, as a culture, that thousands of years ago, our rabbis already had, in this sense, a shred of progressive thinking. So the Torah goes on to say that if we're talking about a woman who is single or divorced or is not married under any circumstances, she is categorically bounded by her vows. That's verse 10. Now, if she vowed in her husband's household, that's verse 12, and her husband heard the vows about not eating sushi until September, he didn't stop her, then she can't eat it. But if the husband says, I know my wife, she will not be able to resist sushi until September, then he can revoke it for her. And these are, as it states in verse 17, at the very bottom of page 825, some of the key guidelines of the halachic parameters of taking a vow, a neder. And again, remember how serious it is that to this day, the intensity and solemnity of Yom Kippur starts with the prayer of undoing the neders, the vows, kol nidrei, right? So that's very important. And as I mentioned, there is an entire volume of the Mishnah just dealing with nedarim, with doing vows, which, when they're in effect, when or not, and how do you undo them, and so forth. Now we move to chapter 31, which is on page 827, and we're moving to the war against Midian. The war against Midian, the Midianites were that people that we spoke about in the last couple of weeks that waged war against us and also were trying to proselytize idolatrous practices. The Hasidic commentaries are always psychological in nature, or moral, or mystical, and the Hasidic interpretation is that this was a war against baseless hatred. Why? Because the word Midian, the name of that people and that place, is close to the Hebrew word madon, which means friction, divisiveness, domestic cleavages. And we are now, in those 3 weeks leading up to Tisha B'Av, and we know the rabbinic literature tells us that the reason that the second temple was destroyed in the year 70, some 2 millennia ago, is because of baseless hatred, because we were so steeped in hatred of our fellow Jew, right? For whatever reason it may have been, religious, ethnic, what have you. So the Hasidic commentary says, this parasha is read during the 3 weeks always. That what is the perpetual relevance of reading it today? Okay, so we fought this war against the Midianites thousands of years ago. It's in the Torah. What's the personal relevance for us? It's telling us that it's the devastation of the home. It's the destruction of the home when you have baseless hatred. God forbid in extended families, in communities, Jewish communities, and the Jewish people, the Jewish nation writ large. We have to work very hard, especially during this time of year, to ponder this and to think about this. And of course we know that 3 times we went to exile in our history, and 3 times it was because of baseless hatred. One is when Joseph's brothers sold him to slavery. The second one was when King Solomon's son took over and did not heed the elders' advice to not employ too many taxes on the people, and then the kingdom of Israel divided into 2, and that was the beginning of the end for the 10 tribes, and then the destruction of the first temple. And then when the Romans besieged Jerusalem in the 1st century to destroy the second temple, as the Romans were besieging Jerusalem, we were murdering each other inside Jerusalem, the radicals against the moderates. So As Rabbi Jonathan Sachs says beautifully, if you look at history, all these great world powers tried to eradicate either the Jewish people or Judaism as a living spiritual practice, from Egypt to Assyria to ancient Babylonia, Persia, leading up to Nazism and Stalinism and more recent times. But we see that they all fail, and eventually they wither away as a viable political historical force. And the only people that can destroy the Jewish people is the Jewish people, right? So that's a very important lesson for our day and age. Another thing that we have in the context of the war against Midian is that we have here the genesis of kosher law, okay? What kind of kosher law? Specifically with regard to utensils. It says here in our parasha that Moses told the people that if they're going to take the utensils of in battle of the Midianites, then they have to be, in a sense, purged of before they can be consumed in a Jewish kosher way. And whatever was consumed by way of fire, let's say today it would be a pot in which you cook pasta, in order to render it kosher, you have to burn it with fire, right? And if it's something that, takes its energy with water, then you have to boil it in water. So really, the genesis of how we render utensils and pots and pans and our silverware kosher is to be found in this week's parasha. And the Orthodox observant custom is that if you go to a store and you purchase new pots and pans or silverware, then the halacha is to go and frequent a mikvah for vessels. Not a mikvah that people go in to immerse themselves, but a mikvah for vessels where you would have to render these utensils, where you would render them kosher by virtue of immersing them in the mikveh water. Why? This is not what, is it the band Queen that has that song, It's a Kind of Magic? Is it Queen? I don't know. It's not a kind of magic. It's an act of mindfulness. We're saying, now we're going to use these utensils that were made basically to feed people physically, and we're going to imbue them with a different dimension, a spiritual dimension. We're going to recite blessings over all the food that we're going to cook or to eat in these pots and pans or plates or what have you. We're going to eat in a spiritual way. Rabbi Professor Louis Jacobs of blessed memory, who was a great British rabbi and scholar, has a couple of books on Hasidism, on Jewish mysticism. One of his books on Hasidism, he has a chapter that I love, and I love the title too. And the title is Eating as a Form of Worship. So if you think about our Friday night table, friends, what we're doing on Friday night around our Shabbat table is a replication of ancient times. When we do the Kiddush over the wine, we're emulating the wine libations on the altar. They would spice up the meat with wine sauce, the way you could cook today or go to a restaurant and order a steak with red wine sauce. So when we do the Kiddush, it's like the wine libations. And when we put the salt, it's also because they used to put the salt, right? And when we wash our hands, it's also because the Kohanim used to wash their hands and feet. So the idea is that when we eat and drink in the Jewish way, we're turning our dining room or kitchen tables into a temple, into an altar for Hashem. And that's the idea behind the philosophy and the practice of immersing in water, which is a source of life and vitality, our vessels before we use them by way of eating and drinking in the Jewish way. Okay? Now we're going to go to what will be this Shabbat, the third Aliyah, which we can find at 833, verse 1. Okay? And here, 833, verse 1, the bottom paragraph. And here we'll, let's see what happens. This, you know what this is about? This is about American Jews. This is about us. I'm serious. You'll see. Fasten your seatbelts. So verse 1. Umiknei rav haya livnei Reuven velivnei Gad atzum. So Reuven and Gad were super wealthy. They had an abundance of livestock. They had stocks, commodities, bonds, real estate, cash fluidity. They had everything. Very numerous. Now, they also had business acumen. Vayru et eretz Yazar ve'et eretz Gilad. They saw in Transjordan, where the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan is today, V'ineh hamakom makom mikneh. Behold, the place was a place for livestock. The Dow Jones was traded there. They saw real estate opportunities. They must have been Jewish. They had a great eye for business opportunities. By the way, one of the reasons that Jewish people, especially in Europe, pioneered early banking and monetary affairs is because in medieval Europe, many Christian kingdoms forbade Jews to own land because they didn't exactly respect our faith. And they said, Jews can only be in one business. You know what that was? Babysitting. No, I'm kidding. It was money lending. Yeah. We were pushed into money lending, which is what banks do, right, today. So because of that, we ended up being instrumental in the foundation and pioneering of early banking. So there is...
Isn't it also that we were always getting kicked out of places? And we had to have a business that we could take with us?
I'm not sure, but maybe. But the point is that... where was I? That... sorry, I lost my thread. The point is that we were not allowed to... So this is what I want to say. There's a verse in Parashat Shemot, in the book of Exodus, that says that the more we were taxed by the Pharaoh, right, higher discriminatory taxes against the Jews, the more slave labor we were subjected to, the more we burst forth in tenacity and strength and outdid ourselves. So that's an example of what happened in a few centuries ago, that the idea was to really corner the Jewish people into a certain economic predicament, but actually it turned out to be advantageous. And Judith, you're correct that, historically we always, Jewish people, we were looking for portable professions. Jews would take their violins. There were certain professions, or physicians, doctors. There are certain universal professions, right? A doctor can practice everywhere. A violinist can play the violin everywhere. So there was something about these universal professions, 100%. So let's go back to the text, verse 2. So these two tribes, Gad and Reuven, they have a great business mind, and they see business opportunity across the Jordan, right? Reminds me when Ali G, Sacha Baron Cohen had his own show. He was interviewing the Crown Prince of Jordan at the time, and he told them, I knew Michael Jordan is a great player, but I didn't know they named a country after him. He thought Jordan was named after... But anyway, this is Transjordan, across the river. So the descendants of Reuben and Gad, these two tribes, Vayavo vayomru el Moshe. They go to Moses, not to be confused with Moses Malone, and to Elazar Kohen, who is now the high priest, because his father Aaron passed away. Ve'el nesiei ha'edah, the leaders of the tribes, all the movers and shakers. And they mention in verse 3 the name of the towns across the Jordan. And look what they say in verse 5 to Moses and the other big shots. If you dig us, if you like us, if we think we're cool and nice, let your servants, let us dwell here in Beverly Hills and in the valley. Let us give us this place as a heritage. Do not take us across the Jordan. Don't take us to LAX to take El Al flights to Israel and make Aliyah. We want to be here. We see opportunities here. This is a good land. This is good for our kids. And this, for Moses, for somebody like Moses, that could ruin his whole day, his whole day, his entire day. What does Moses say to God and Reuven in verse 6? Moses gets really upset. Check this out. Moses' response to them. Ha'achechem yavou lamilchama va'atem tishvu po. This is verse 6 on 835. Your brethren will go to war and you will sit here at the coffee bean? Interesting, right? Not only that, says Moses in verse 7, Velama teni'un et lev b'nei Yisrael me'avo el haaretz asher natan lahem Hashem. You're going to make the other people who do want to make Aliyah and go to Israel and get an Israeli passport, you're going to make them, you're going to discourage them. You're going to make them second guess themselves. Right? And in verse 8, he says, that's what the 10 spies did when they said we can't go to Israel, right? And in verse 10, he says to them, God had a really bad day that day when the 10 spies infected the rest of the nation with defeatism, right? And in verse 14, Moses really gives it to them. He says, you didn't learn anything from the 10 spies and the previous generation and their defeatism. Tarbut anashim chataim. You have a culture, a society of sin. You're going to make God even more upset. Now look what they say to him on verse 16. They're still trying to convince Moses to live in Los Angeles. On verse 16, they approached him, being Moses, and said, we're going to build here a fence for our sheep and live flocks and cities for our children. Okay? So we're going to create here our capital and cities for our children with parks and schools. You will see that when Moses answers them, a few verses down the line, Moses is going to reverse the order. But first things first. But what do they say? They make a disclaimer in verse 17. We will come quickly before the Israelis who are going to go to Israel. Verse 18. Lo nashuv el beitenu. We're not going to go back home and our children until our brothers and sisters in Israel, the Israelis, have taken possession of the land, until they are secure in the land of Israel. In other words, what the Jews of Los Angeles are saying to Moses is that we are not going to sit still and only worry about ourselves as long as our brothers and sisters in Israel are not fully entrenched and secure. Which is still the case. Do you know, friends, that when the state of Israel was founded in 1948, David Ben-Gurion, as the first prime minister, the Knesset legislated certain emergency laws for times of war that are in effect to this day. Because even though Israel is now in its 71st year, as we speak in the Jewish year 5778, corresponding to the Gregorian year 2018, in many ways Israel is still continuing its war of independence. Right? So, Moses says to them in verse 20, we're on page 837, If you're really not going to just sit in coffee bean all day and really help the Israelis, if you arm and pioneer yourself for war, and the land will be conquered, and then you can go back to Century City, you will be guilt-free. You will not have a moral deficit vis-a-vis the Jews of Israel. And you can become good Jewish Americans, verse 22. But if you're just going to live in America and not care about the Jews of Israel, and not care about the situation of the Jews in Europe, or the Jews who are still in the Middle East, say in Turkey or Iran to this day, chatatem l'Hashem. You're sinning before Hashem. In other words, there is a deal here. And this deal continues to this day. Right? As Jewish Americans, we are a very intellectual culture. We teach our children to learn and to develop the mind and to pursue higher education, Jewish and practical, non-Jewish. And that's why Jews excel, because we're a very intellectual, hyper-literate civilization. So we have a moral responsibility to make sure that with the political and economic and cultural assets and capital of American Jewry, we need to support the Jews of Israel. And truth be told, Baruch Hashem, we do. I don't think Israel would have survived the diplomatic tsunami that it has been subjected to since its very inception, had it not been to the way that we as Jewish Americans support Israel and inspire and encourage also our Christian neighbors to support Israel. And they do, big time, right? So, many of them at least. So this is a teaching for us, that the Torah is saying to us here tacitly, the way I understand it, yes, we are an Am Olam, which means both an eternal people and an undying people, but we're also a global people. Today everybody is global, it's all news, but we were the first global people, at least in the Western Hemisphere, what is today the Middle East and Europe. But we have a commitment to our brothers and sisters in Israel. And we cannot sit idly here and just concentrate on ourselves as long as the Jews of Israel are not fully secure. And unfortunately, that day hasn't arrived yet. Right? Now notice, I mentioned before that when Gad and Reuven, these two tribes, who later on with half the tribe of Menashe, settled outside the boundaries of the western land of Israel, they said, but we want to build here fences for our property and towns for our children. In other words, they said, we want to build a business here and educate our children. That was the order. Look how Moses flips it on verse 24. He says to him, Bnu lachem arim letapchem. Build cities for your kids, ugderot letzonechem, and enclosures for your possessions. Moses reversed the order. In other words, he's telling them, prioritize the education of your children first. The children should get the best Jewish education that you can, and the best secular education. And then also make an enclosure here for your capital, right? So it's a very interesting and important message. It's good to think long term. Rabbi Sachs once wrote an article called Think Long. And in many ways, if a person is a young Jewish parent in their 20s and 30s, they should think half a century ahead. Should think 50 years ahead. And they should think, should I send my children to a Jewish day school or not? So obviously Jewish day schools are very expensive. Not everybody can do that, or at least incur loans or things like that, or we need a fellowship. So obviously it's a very personal matter. But, if a person says to themselves, on the one hand I could send them to a Jewish school, And by the way, we have ample research that children who go to a Jewish day school become way more involved and more committed to have a Jewish household and raise their kids Jewish. Or on the one hand, I could not send them to a Jewish school, and then I could go to the Bahamas twice a year. So if you think 50 years ahead, you think about the Shabbat table with your children and your children's children. It's the idea of thinking 50 years down the line. But in any event, Moses is flipping the order and tells them from a Jewish cultural perspective, the education of our children takes priority over redoing our kitchen. Right? So that's that. And the parasha continues to specify the places in Transjordan that they settled in and that they built. The members of the tribe of Gad and Reuven, so they actually settled down there and established certain municipalities. Now, yesterday, I heard a very nice Dvar Torah from the chief rabbi of Great Britain. Okay? And what's his name? Rabbi Ephraim. Let me tell you exactly. Mervis, I believe. He's South African. He's the current chief rabbi of Great Britain and the Commonwealth, the former British colonies. And it's important to say, when you learn something from someone, to quote them. As the Mishnah says, whoever brings a quote in the name of the person that you learned it from, bring redemption to the world. Why? Because you're putting your ego aside. You're not saying it's my idea, it's this person's idea. It could be a business thing you learned. It doesn't have to be strictly Torah. But it's a very good thing to give people credit. So Rabbi Mervis, I was listening to his message on the Parsha yesterday as I was walking, and he turns our attention to something very interesting at the end of Parashat Matot, the first of the two Parshas. And we look at verse 42, which at the very top of 841, there was a guy called Novach. Okay? Novach went, and he captured a city called Knat. Okay? And the surrounding villages around it. Right? It was like a county. And how did he call the area that he conquered? Novach. He named it after himself. All right?
What was his name? Noah?
Novach. Now, why?
841 page.
And at the top. And why? So why do you think he named it after himself? Why do people name things after themselves? Ego, and to be remembered for perpetuity.
Yeah.
But Rashi says something ingenious. He says, Vaikrala, and he called her, meaning that area, Novach. But the word la in Hebrew, lamed hey, should really have a dot in the hey, which means to that city, to that place. If it doesn't have the dot, Rashi says, rather than read it la, to this place, you can read it lo, which means no. That's not the best way to be remembered. Yes, it's great to give tzedakah, and there's nothing wrong with people who choose to have whatever they give a fortune to named after them. There's nothing wrong with that. But ultimately, what people are going to remember you for, in the long run, in the words of Rabbi Mervis, that's how he said it yesterday, I thought it was beautiful, so I'm going to quote him verbatim, is the way you touched hearts and molded minds. The way you touched hearts and molded minds, right? The emotional support you gave to people, and the interpersonal support, the social, the psychological, the care, the concern, and the kind of life wisdom and experience that you shared with people. These are your enduring legacies. These are your most enduring legacies, right? So that's a great teaching that we have at the last verse of the parasha, that ultimately people are remembered, even people who are exceptionally generous monetarily, and God blesses them for that. Ultimately, human nature is such that we ultimately remember people for their character, for how they were and how they behaved, right? And what they taught us and how they treated us, right? So that's a great teaching from Chief Rabbi Mervis. This brings us, friends, to the second Torah portion that we read this Shabbat, Parashat Masei, which is on page 841, chapter 33. Ele Masei v'nei Israel. These are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out of Egypt by the hand of Moses and Aaron. Vayichtov Moshe et motzaim lemaseihem. And Moses wrote their journeys. He had like a little journal. I don't know if it was on an iPad or on his iPhone, but he had kept a journal. And this will be, by the way, the fifth aliyah for the two parashot this Shabbat. Actually, it's the middle of the fifth. So I'm going to find it here with Rashi as well. Okay. Verse 1. Okay, so where is it? Sheni. Okay, I went forward. My bad. Let me, bear with me 1 second. I have to find the place. I think I went too far. Okay, this is verse 4. Here we go. Okay, so it's in the fourth aliyah this Shabbat, right in the middle. In any event, we are on page 841, verse 1. Sorry about that. So these are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out of Egypt. And there are 42 journeys. There are 42 stops. Okay? And it says in verse 3, we left Ramses. Some people conjecture that the Exodus narrative pertains to the Pharaoh who was the son of Ramses II. So Ramses is the kind of guy who named a lot of things after himself, right? So they went from a place called Ramses, just like Stalingrad and Leningrad, these people named those things after themselves. On the first month, which is Nisan, on the 15th day, right after the Pesach, Yatzu Bnei Israel beyad Ramah. We came with the mighty hands, with lots of possessions out of Egypt. Le'nei kol Mitzrayim. U'Mitzrayim mekabrim et asher hika Hashem b'hem. And the Egyptians were still licking their wounds from the 10 plagues. Verse 5. And we drove in a Nisan, right? Since it was the month of Nisan, we drove Nisan cars. Vaysu bnei Yisrael miMramses vayachanu beSukkot. From Ramses, we parked in Sukkot. We found parking lots with good, reasonable prices in a place called Sukkot. There was a place called Sukkot, right? And Jacob also stopped in a place called Sukkot earlier in the Torah. So the Sukkot represent a place called Sukkot. They represent the booths that we carried around and lived in. And they also represent God's protection over us. Okay? So there was a place called Sukkot. From Sukkot, we went to a place called Eitam. And from Eitam, we went to a place called Al-Pi HaCherut, which means literally on the mouth of freedom. And Rashi explains that why is it called the mouth of freedom? Because this was like the north and the south before the civil war in this country. This was a place that if a slave made it, their master could not take them back, right? So let's say in the 1850s, if a slave made it to the D.C. area or to the New York area, they were safe, right? They couldn't, they were free there. So similarly in antiquity, there was a place that if you ran away as a slave and you made it, you wouldn't be able to be apprehended and taken back. Okay? So that was another one of these places, Al Pi HaCherut. And it continues to tell you the names of all these places. One place is called Morah, because the water was bitter and we were complaining, which is an ancient Jewish sport to Hashem, that we want San Pellegrino water instead of the bitter water, and we want the San Pellegrino to be sparkling and not still. You know the story. I heard Rabbi Sachs say once that somebody sent him like a little cartoon of a Jewish lady advanced in age walking with a cane when the sea is split, and she points with her cane. There are some puddles, and she points with her cane at the puddle, and she looks up and she says to God, "What about the puddles? What about the puddles?" That there are puddles in the middle, right? There's another joke about a Jewish grandmother who takes her grandson to the beach in Santa Monica, and they're bathing in the beach, and suddenly comes a huge wave, and she can't see the grandkid. She flips out and says, "Please, God, I beg you, bring him back." And suddenly a wave comes and washes the kid back into her arms, safe and sound. So the Jewish grandma looks up and says, "He was also wearing a hat." Okay? So lots of complaining going on here. And it talks about how we were at the Sea of Reeds, Yam Suf. In the Aryeh Kaplan translation, there's actually a map on page 843 with the various stops. And then the Torah, in very detailed ways, verses 12 to 38, to verse 38 on page 847, it actually gives you the name of every place. And they traveled to this place, and they encamped in that place. And actually, you see, some of those places we go back. So the Kabbalah teaches that the 42 stops in the desert represent the 42 stops that a person needs to make in the ladder of personal and spiritual growth. You know, we have a Kabbalistic meditation on Friday night known as Anna Bechor. Anna Bechor, Gedulat Yamincha Tatir Tzura. It's 6 lines. Each one of them has 7 words. Altogether, how many words? 42. Right? Isn't that, what is the name of that popular American novel where they say that the meaning of life is 42? Something with galaxy. The Traveler's Guide to the Galaxy, whatever.
Oh.
You know what I'm talking about? In any event...
Or is it The Hitchhiker's Guide?
Yeah, The Hitchhiker's Guide. Very good. Not to be confused with Hitchcock's. Now, Alfred Hitchcock. So the Kabbalah says that this talks about our journey in life. As I mentioned previously, most of the Torah narrative, 2/3, from the 15th Torah portion, Bo, until the end of the 54th, 70% of the Torah, good 70%, is a journey from Egypt, leaving Egypt, en route to Israel. But we never enter the promised land in the Torah. We always go back to Genesis on Simchat Torah. Comes to teach us that our life is about a journey. We will never become completely perfect, because then we would be God, we wouldn't be a person, right? It says in Kohelet, in Ecclesiastes, King Solomon teaches us, En Adam Tzadik Ba'az Asher Lo Yechata. There's no such thing, a person who's a complete tzaddik who never sins, right? We're all what the philosopher Kant called the crooked timber of humankind. We're all like a piece of wood that can't be completely straightened out. But we do our best. And that's the purpose of life, to grow and to improve and to learn, right? And to evolve. That's why also in the Midrash, the rabbis deliberate at a coffee bean, maybe, what is the purpose of the mitzvot? Why do we have all these spiritual and ethical obligations? And the answer that the purpose of all the mitzvot is letzaref et habriyot, which means to refine the soul, to become a more refined person. So those 42 stops, those national historical stops in the desert, really represent the fact that we have those levels, that those different stops that we need to grow from one place to the other. You know, it's fascinating. The gestation period of an elephant is 22 months, right? An elephant in its womb, in the womb of its mother, is 22 months. And if you watch on YouTube, somebody once sent me a birth of an elephant. The minute the elephant comes out, the mother starts hitting the baby elephant with its trunk, that the elephant starts walking and fetching its own food. Now think about us. It takes weeks, if not a couple of months, until the infant raises his or her chin. And then the parents are ecstatic. They call the grandparents, look, he or she raised their chin. Not to mention crawling and walking and learning how to speak and learning how to read and write and learning how to use the bathroom. But when we get there, we can write Shakespearean sonnets, and we can study Torah and create more Torah, and we can send space shuttles to outer space. Right? So we start slow, but slow and steady wins the race. So that's another lesson from the idea of the 42 stops, is that you have to learn how to consolidate in life. I remember I had a neighbor in Israel, when I was living in Israel, who told me, he was a Baal Tshuva, he didn't grow up observant, he became observant. And he told me that he had a neighbor who overnight became super religiosus. He discovered the world of Torah, and almost overnight, I'm exaggerating slightly, he started sporting a long beard and a black hat and the black garb, it's called a kapote, the Hasidic garb. And he said it was so extreme that after a while he just abandoned everything. So you have to learn how to pace yourselves when you grow. Each time, whatever it is, if you want to get back into physical fitness or spiritual fitness, right, you have to pace yourself. Slow and steady wins the race. Whenever I tried to lose a lot of weight in one shot and went on a crazy diet, I regained all the weight. So whatever it is you do, you want to pace yourself, right? You make a little, let's say, I want to start jogging. So maybe at the beginning I'm just going to start walking, and I'm going to walk and then I'm going to run X. You want to kind of pace yourself. You conquer some ground. It's like going to first base in baseball, right? And then second base. The gradualism is the road to sustainable success and enduring results, right? That's another teaching, great teaching that we have here. Okay? Another one is that we live now in a world, there's a great writer, a novelist in Paris. I think he's still alive. I hope so. His name is Milan Kundera. He's originally from the former Czechoslovakia. He's Czech. And he wrote a book, I think in the late 90s, called Slowness. He actually wrote it in French. In French it's called La Lenteur. And he's talking about how he's driving on the highway in France and how everything is so fast now, right? Today, even more so with the iPhone, we're running around. It's like we only live in the here and now. We don't live in the present. What's the difference in the here and now and the present? The here and now is I'm just thinking about my next appointment after this class and my other appointments today. The present is when I stop and I actually think about the fact that yesterday I took a couple of hours off and I did this and I did that. Or when you think about your life, what is the present? It's Shabbat. On Shabbat, you're supposed to just sit back, come to synagogue, sing, reflect, meditate, learn wisdom, socialize, and then you can kind of look at your life and think about the week that just passed by and think about the week that's coming up. The same thing tonight is Rosh Chodesh. Beginning of a new month is another opportunity, right? Rosh Hashanah, the high holidays, God has given us with His Torah those existential signposts where we can stop our journeys in life and reflect and just be. And if we don't, then we don't really have a present. We just have the here and now. And it's a very impoverished existence. It's only about schlepping around for business, but not thinking about the great narrative, the great poetry of our lives. how we came to this country, or our parents came to this country, where we came from, what we've achieved, what we've been trying to do, right? What are our values? What are our goals? Where are we now? Where do we want to go? You got to have these stops in life where you can stop and reflect and look at your life like a beautiful, elegant fan that you can open and look how colorful and beautiful your path in life is. There's a beautiful letter that the late Yoni Netanyahu wrote once to a friend, and he says, my path, my road will be my road. And sometimes it will go through the wilderness and the desert, sometimes it will go into steep valleys, and sometimes it would be mountainous. But in all its twists and turns and curves, it will be my own journey, which is mysterious and known at the same time. Right? We should all take time to look at our life's project from a bird's eye view perspective. It's one of the things that makes us human beings. Right? I don't know, I think ants work very hard, and they carry a lot on their back, and they have a great work ethic. I don't know if ants have this reflective ability to think about their life story, but we do, and part of the idea of the journeys is to do just that. Okay, so these are some reflections on the journeys. Okay, now I'll say a few things before we wrap up in a couple of minutes. What should we wrap up with? A Parashot. Okay, I'm gonna end up with the following theme. Let's go, which is in the final portion for this Shabbat, page 857, verse 9. 857, verse 9 is going to give us a new biblical Torah concept that existed in the ancient world, a legal mechanism. What is the name of the guy who leaked the WikiLeaks? You remember? Whatever.
Julian Assange.
Thank you. Is he Swedish? Where is he from? I think he's Swedish.
I think he's from,
anyway,
Sweden.
Wherever he's from, where is he living now for several years?
British.
In the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The British police wants to arrest him because he's being accused of a crime in Sweden. It's part of the EU. But he's untouchable. Why? Because he's at an embassy. Jonathan Pollard, who was a spy, when he realized the FBI is going to arrest him, he ran to the Israeli embassy in D.C. to ask for asylum. The door wasn't opened for him. But if you're in an embassy, you can't be touched. Right? That's why it was such a violation of diplomatic protocol when the Iranian students broke into the American embassy in Tehran in the 80s, right? So it's a complete violation of the diplomatic ethic. Now, in ancient times, we didn't necessarily have embassies that are like a protected space. But what did we have? We had the concept of cities of refuge. So there was a cultural norm that was rampant, pervasive in the ancient Near East that still exists in some quarters in the Islamic and the Arab world to this day, which is called, in Hebrew, nikmat dam, the avenging of blood. Unfortunately, you read in the Middle East, where I grew up, or some of us grew up, you can read in the paper that a girl was murdered by her own brothers or father because she supposedly violated the family honor by dating someone before she was married. Sometimes only being seen with him, Now, so in the ancient Near East, somebody would die, and there was this cultural perception that, God forbid, if something happened to my brother, then it's incumbent upon me to avenge the blood of my brother and take the law into my own hands and kill the person who, God forbid, killed, let's say, my sister, since I don't have a sister. So the Torah wants to put an end to this. right? Because we don't want to be in a situation of Isha Yashar Be'enav Yaseh, everybody just do whatever they see fit, right? That's anarchy. We don't want that. Because according to the philosopher Thomas Hobbes, then life would be nasty, brutish, and short. So the Torah created a city of refuge where if there was an accident, right? If somebody climbed on a ladder and then fell from the ladder and killed another person, fell on their head, it was accidental homicide, right? As opposed to murder. So this person could go to one of these cities of refuge where the relatives of the deceased could not track him down and kill him. And he would have to demur to stay in that city of refuge until the Kohen Gadol, the high priest, would pass away. And then he could come back outside that safe zone and not be in harm's way from the relatives of the deceased. So that's an interesting kind of legal mechanism that the Torah employed in ancient times so that people don't take the law into their own hands. So we conclude with the following question. What's in it for us in Los Angeles in 2018 and 5778? So Kabbalah teaches, Hasidism teaches, that what is an Ir Miklat? What is a city of refuge? The Torah. We just spent an hour of our lives immersed in the city of refuge, which is Torah. We sought refuge from all the things that we struggle with individually and privately in life, and we immersed ourselves in the safety and in the profundity and the life-enhancing merits of Torah. Shabbat is a city of refuge. Torah study is a city of refuge. Prayer is a city of refuge. So today we don't have cities of refuge as that municipal kind of safe zone, but our sages tell us that Jewish spiritual life in and of itself constitutes a city of refuge from the relentless pace and mayhem of the world and the continuous, interminable material and psychological and physical demands that life makes upon us. V'chol hamarbe harei ze meshubach. As it says in the Passover Haggadah, the more we immerse ourselves in the city of refuge of Shabbat, Jewish holidays, prayer, Torah study, the more exquisite it is and the more refined, empowered, and strengthened we are. Okay? So these are some of the chief highlights of Matot-Masei, and thank you for coming to learn together. Have a holy rest of the day and a Shabbat Shalom.